Hi, and welcome to the Seamless Blend, digital textile dialogues with Gabby and Jørgen. Our primary purpose is to educate and initiate discussions. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not constitute professional advice or services. We invite contributions from our audience and maintain an open community on Discord.
Hello. Welcome back. Welcome back to episode 7 of the Seamless Blend. This week, our episode is called Can DPC Resurrect Itself? We've gone with a Halloween theme, shamelessly gone with a Halloween theme. And I have to say it's because I'm also on half term and having to do a lot of Halloween preparation for my family. So full disclosure, Halloween is happening in this house. So can DPC resurrect itself? We're going to talk around that because our previous episodes in season 2 have talked about where DPC is, the rise and fall, and those kind of points. Just a brief introduction of myself. My name is Gabby Shiner-Hill, co-founder of Bureau 555, a digital materials agency. I'm also an academic and researcher, and I'm here with Jørgen. So hello, Jørgen.
Yes. Well, so my name is Jørgen. I've been working in the textiles, textiles industry, mostly from Hong Kong for about a little over 10 years, working with fabric mills and garment manufacturers. And I would say probably half of that time I've been focusing on digital technologies and digital fabrics and 3D and DPC. And I think that's where Gabby and I also have come together to do this little podcast and live stream. We're in this second season, we're doing things a little bit differently from the first season. We're doing this shorter episodes, roughly about 20 minutes. And we're trying to kind of break it down a key topic each time. And this time in particular, I think since the last time we did an episode, I've started, I guess we could call it a little hobby or kind of like a work-related hobby, but I felt like it was useful for me to start to write down some of the things that I was, wondering or needed to define in my work and things that were relevant to the things that we're discussing here as well. So I started to go all the way back to a definition of DPC and what that really means, and kind of just starting to share some of those thoughts online. So that's kind of what's been happening in the last week, and we thought we could maybe just summarize that quickly. And I would like to, in particular, hear what Gabby thinks about it. But just to kind of quickly go over and summarize is I felt like it was important to define DPC, and it almost like, at least from my point of view, and that's all that I'm trying to do, just to kind of define it from my own point of view. And I would like to share this online and to hear what other people think. So if anyone's listening to this and they want to read over and tell me what you think, please do. I think a definition was very important because we need to be able to share the same language of what we're actually talking about and what DPC actually means. There's not like a universal definition of DPC, and I have also not created, the one definition that's going to last for all times. It's just been an attempt of summarizing it for me, and I think that's important because it feels like we're in a bit of a time right now where the industry has there was a lot of rush around DPC with COVID and just before COVID, and I think everyone was very excited about DPC. It's now fallen down a little bit, and we've kind of maybe lost a bit of track of what the original intentions and promises of DPC was, what some of the key objectives that we wanted to achieve with DPC was. And I think it's just important sometimes to come back, and in particular in times like this, when the last 6 months to a year has been a time period of slowing down. So that's really kind of where at least I was coming from with this, of then trying to go back and summarize and root us back into like what was it that we were trying to do with DPC, and can we come back and see and reevaluate whether, are we still on course to achieve the same things, or do we need to do things a little differently? So you read over this, Gabby, and what do you think so far?
Well, first of all, I'm really impressed that you're calling an industry opinion blog a hobby. I think it should be. I think it's more than that, personally. But I have read your comments, and I was really interested in them. And I think I completely agree with you that digital product creation has kind of lost its way a little bit, or been undefined, because actually DPC could mean different things for different companies. So I can think of already like 2 examples where DPC is really different from 2 different companies we work with. One would be, and I think I sound a bit like a broken record, but talking about a digital materials library, essentially digitizing your materials on hand so that you can have all the information there, quick react, you know what's in stock, you know what's ready to go, you know what you've got prepared for die, you've literally got a visual library of all of your materials within your supply chain. That is digital product creation. That is a variation on digital product creation.
Yeah.
That could be one of them. Another one could be digital lab dip approvals. So it could literally be where you're now digitizing the lab dip process. You're reducing down your shipping of lab dips. You're actually approving them with the spectrophotometer. So it's a digital lab dip approval. That is an element of digital product creation. Or it could be that you're a garment manufacturer, you're used to making really, really detailed and production ready tech packs, and those which are production ready and ready to go, you want those to be translated into 3D garments so you can show those 3D garments to your customer pre-sign off, essentially. And all of those things could be defined, or all of those workflows could be defined as DPC, and some might say they all link into what digital product creation is. But as a company, you might just be doing one or two of those things.
Yeah.
Quite rare to be doing all of them together. So I think it sounds quite simple, but when having any conversation about DPC, it has to be defined, like, well, which area are we talking about, and how far down the supply chain are you going, and which business units in your company are you bringing into this journey with you? You know, because we know that if so I'm saying we know, what we've seen is if digital product creation is parked with designers who are very under-resourced already, and they are asked to sit there and develop and design in 3D on top of their fabric sourcing, their designing, their trend forecasting, and then their garment creation that they have to do, we know it can fall by the wayside because it's just there aren't enough resources placed there to create the movement behind the digital product creation. So that was my little soapbox, I guess, moment
No, I think those are
that.
really, those really good points. And I think in particular, one thing that I realized as I was kind of going through this and writing some notes about it is, I think a lot of companies came into this thinking that, maybe in the beginning and around the kind of hype of a lot of this technology coming into focus, a lot of companies were looking for almost like a quick and easy way to just like bring in new technology and solve a whole bunch of problems. And I think that's also where this like we've seen now that there was this promise, and now later we can see actually what the reality was. And whereas maybe the promises might have been overhyped quite a lot in the beginning, and now that we see the reality kind of looking backwards, we can also see that it was quite expensive for a lot of companies to implement DPC, and even just almost like implementing 3D tools and training everyone to now suddenly change their workflows completely. And these tools are also they're not necessarily always meant to just come in and support the existing workflows that designers and developers have already had. You have to change the workflows fundamentally.
Yeah, it's
That's
not like
where I think a lot of
it's not an extension of Illustrator, for example, which is essentially what everyone's been making their tech packs in, let's be honest, right? It's not, and also most people have been making them from like, historical tech packs that exist. So quite often, most of the designers I work with, we had tech packs from a previous designer, and you've built on them, and you might have kind of put your own spin on them, and you might have standardized them in some way within your organization, but if you're not Adidas or Nike or PVH, essentially you've kind of like built on them time and time again. They're not super standardized. So offering in an entirely new suite of technologies is a really big ask, really big ask.
It is. And I think in particular also this, like, the human element of it. And you mentioned this, I think also, in our earlier conversation about this, this bit of almost like there can be quite a lot of resistance to change because people are used to doing things in a certain way. And that's also not something to be underestimated. That I think we're seeing that DPC wasn't fully defined necessarily all the way from the beginning, and a lot of companies might have kind of gone into it very quickly without having very clear objectives and a very clear breakdown of how they were going to achieve those objectives, and then maybe just bringing in tools or having 3D companies, 3D design software technologies come in and do a lot of the training without necessarily fully understanding the implementation into a company. And I think that's also something important to consider, and something that you've mentioned as well, Gabby. Or like, what do you think about almost like that, the human element of it, or the cultural element of it in the company?
Yeah, and actually, so when I was reading your article the other day about the rise and the fall, there's a specific element in the article about cultural resistance. So it is talking about, and your point, and I'm not trying to completely dissect your article, but your point is talking about how designers can often feel like they are obviously quite skilled and they have a craft, and that's what they are working on, and that's they're developing their skills and they're bringing those skills to the company they work with. And I think in certain environments that's very true. In the environment that I've always worked in, which is essentially sort of like high street to premium high street, so we're talking like mass market, large volume, delivering into large brands and retailers, it's very much that I would say designers are product developers. We consider ourselves a piece of the puzzle, a part of that industrialized production process, as opposed to we're crafting and designing. So I think it's less that I can't speak for all designers. I think it's less that designers feel like they're having their craft maybe taken away from them by having to use a new piece of software or develop in a new different way. I believe it's much more that head offices don't see the design and development process as a valuable process, right? Because it often happens within the designers, right? It's the designers it's in the designers' WhatsApp groups, right? It's in their emails, it's with their relationships with their garment manufacturers, it's with their relationships with their garment techs. So it can't be sort of quantified and valued in the same way that a production process can be, for example. So I'm not saying that, I'm saying designers are in this area are highly skilled. But the issue is, I believe that the designers within this area aren't valued in the same way as the production process, if that makes sense. And they're not valued because it can't be quantified as easily as saying, we can gain an efficiency here by working with this garment manufacturer who has a really efficient line. So therefore we can shave 2 minutes off of this. We can shave, 2 centimeters off of this.
Yeah.
Design doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
Yeah. But maybe even almost like, as you mentioned, I think it's a really interesting point about, the role of the designer and maybe how the designers see themselves. And maybe a lot of, young people that go into fashion design in school, go into it with a little bit of an impression that fashion design is this, job where you stand with both hands on a table and, almost like do like tailor work, and you do a lot of craftsmanship or kind of craft work in your job. And then maybe also come out into the fashion industry where things are just a lot more industrialized in that way. And
100%.
It's an industry. You're not just like a tailor that gets to do whatever you want to do. You have tight schedules and you have a lot to do and you're under resourced and all these things. And I think even that part is a really good point of like almost like just like a misunderstanding maybe often of what the designers are supposed to do.
And I think, and the one last point on this is not seeing the design and development process as a core competency. Therefore, it hasn't been sort of, clearly defined and optimized as other areas of the business have. Like merchandising has been optimized, right? Production has been optimized. Design has not been optimized, quite clearly has not been optimized. And can you, and should you? I'm not saying you should optimize it. I'm just saying, inherently, to see that some of the DPC's efficiencies, you need to optimize the tasks you're doing. Can we optimize?
No, I think it's a really good point. What you also you mentioned this before, and I think this is one of the really good pieces of what should I say, almost like not feedback, but like comments or thoughts. And this is why, again, the main reason of why I'm writing these things up is I'll say this out loud, is like it is primarily for myself, that I can then get some clarity on my own thinking, and then I want to share these things out there so that anyone can read it and tell me what they think. And exactly like what you did, and back to the topic of, as you said, almost like optimizing. You mentioned before also on how one big problem we're having in the industry, and we both know this because we worked on the manufacturing side. We know that, for example, DPC is very related to the prototyping or sampling and prototyping work that happens in this process. And a lot of times, as you said, it's not necessarily that part isn't necessarily being measured in a very open and transparent way. That a lot of the factories are measured or communicate, their resourcing and these things to the brands mainly on the basis of production, and eventually, like all the pieces that are going to be delivered in the final, bulk order, rather than evaluating or measuring down to the smallest little detail the prototyping and sampling work that goes into it. And when DPC then also is coming into help us in particular with that prototyping process. And these tools are built for us to, in particular, kind of go in and attack prototyping and sampling and reduce the amount of prototyping and sampling that needs to be done. I think if you don't have already a lot of good measurement of, how much resources, how many meters of fabric and how many garments are you making, or, different product categories you might be having to do, garment finishes and washes and so forth. And if you don't track all that as a very important part of the process, then how are we then, after we implement DPC, how are we then going to be able to measure what the actual impact was if we never really measure the traditional process in the first place?
Completely. And I think it's this same line that virtual prototyping, so DPC, is going to make you more sustainable if you are not asking how many samples you are making. And let's remember, garment factories don't make samples for the sake of making samples. They don't do it for the good of their own health. They do it because they're requested to make them by the brands and the retailers. So I'm not in any way saying garment manufacturers are making too many samples. The issue really is if you're not quantifying how many samples you're making, and not just the ones that you receive in head office, all of the samples, because there's one for you, there's one for your buying office, there's usually one kept in the factory, all of your samples throughout that, all of the wash legs, all of the 30 plus lab dip colors you might have requested. If you're not quantifying that and reporting on that, then where is the incentive to reduce that? And I think that's really the key, because sampling isn't being sampling isn't being fed into the official reporting. So, and I think if you're a factory, you know how many samples you make, because it goes through it. That you have this information. Are you being asked for it by the brands, and are you giving it back to them and saying you made X many samples this, you wove up this much material, you made X many samples last season, let's look at what we can do this to improve next season. So I think that's where virtual prototyping as a means to being more sustainable, I would say, falls down slightly, because if you're not reporting on sampling in the first place, how do you intend to prove that you are better than you were last year or last season?
Yeah, no, I think this has also really almost like inspired me as a part of this newfound process of trying to write down some of these things. Is that like the next thing that I really want to look into is exactly this thing, and maybe we'll come back and talk about that. But can we maybe establish, like as you said, a lot of factories, like of course they measure, or they have an ID, or they have certain data points on how many prototypes, how many samples they make. But even for me, in my past, I would say almost 10 years of having worked with factories and fabric mills and garment factories, I've never worked with and I'm talking more, not necessarily about the absolute biggest factories that really have a lot of stuff under control, but the majority of like the volume of factories out there don't necessarily have good systems on this, and don't even evaluate the amount of sampling and really kind of look at those numbers frequently. And I think we need to have that kind of measurement in place in order for us to be able to understand the impact of DPC, when that's where the impact is supposed to be. And the industry is kind of hiding this a little bit at the moment. Like no one is really looking at the prototyping and sampling, even though we know that, like I've worked with factories that have openly said that they spend about 20 to 30% of the entire cost of running the factory on prototyping. And these processes. So I think it's very, like there's a bit of hidden numbers in there that not everyone has a very clear idea of. So that's going to be important.
Very much so. But what I also would say is there are certain companies out there which haven't always gone down that route, or have made different changes. And I'm not sort of here to champion different companies, but I did supply M&S for a long time. And back in the day when I was supplying them back in 2015, 16, so a good while ago, they were reducing down their hit rate, which is the number of samples versus what they bought. And that was a real focus for them. So, that was, 9-10 years ago. They were doing it. And I have friends that work in different high street brands and premium high street brands, specifically in tailoring, for example, which actually they don't do any samples at all, because they have standard shirts or standard suiting styles, and they just buy off of hand looms the way we used to back in the 90s. So it's a case by case point, because there could be someone listening to this going, but we don't do that. So of course it's a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
Some brands don't do that, but also some brands do. So that's kind of where we are.
No, exactly. And I think that's, of course, again, just highlighting that point of there's a bit of a lack of standardization, or a standard kind of way of doing things that, some people are doing, or some companies are doing, some people are not doing it. that's just almost like up to every individual company. And I think it's also important for the manufacturers. And I think I'm particularly interested in understanding, like, can the manufacturer also have a better reporting system? And like the brand should be tracking it on their side. But I think the manufacturers also could have a much better overview on how much work goes into all this.
Because they'll be then pushing for DPC as well, and then as leading into, as you said, supplier-led DPC. I guess.
Yeah, maybe that's almost like the title of the episode was, "Can we resurrect DPC?" So, what do you have any almost like brief theories at the end of this episode about where is DPC going to go from? Like, it's not dead, and the technology is fundamentally, it has strong evidence of like that it has positive impact on the industry. It's more about figuring out how we're going to implement it and getting it in the right way. So now we're a bit of a low point down in a bit of a valley of having kind of gone over the hype, and everyone is rethinking and looking at their priorities and these things. Like, what's next for DPC, do you think?
I think there's two things on my side. I know we obviously shouldn't just be looking for quick wins, but personally, when I'm talking to companies, I am trying to show them where they could have a quick win. So I am actually trying to point them and shine a light on areas where I can say, if you do digital lab dip approvals, you will see a fantastic return on investment with reducing down your shipping, with reducing down the number of lab dips. You will gain time. You'll be given back time, honestly. So I think having some areas where we can see some good quick wins will be really good. And I think the area for me is actually looking at just education and speaking between the technology companies and speaking between the brands as well. So not just keeping it internal if possible, and sharing that knowledge a bit more.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. I think that's I think for my part, I'm actually in the process of, I'm going to try to get it out this weekend, but I'm trying to make a little third article that I can share, which is going to be a little bit of a hypothesis of, as you mentioned, and we've talked about this, because it's kind of, I think my idea of where that DPC could go next. I'm not saying that there's one kind of definitive direction that it has to go, but I think very much that there's an opportunity for, in particular, garment vendors to take advantage of DPC, and to, rather than, like, we're going to need the brands, retail brands and designers are going to have to drive DPC. But I think a lot of the technical work and a lot of the work that has currently, like, we've been trying to have the brands do, can actually be done by garment manufacturers, so that they can then offer DPC kind of workflows as a bit of a value add to brands. And maybe brands are then in the future going to be more, kind of like on the high point, or on like a low touch DPC, where designers are going to be working more towards the brand's market and finding out what kind of products should we be making to service the customers that we have. And how can we convert our mood boards and trend directions and all these different things into more like lightweight or kind of high level sketches and these things. And a lot more of the technical work, I think, could be happening on the garment side. And then garment vendors will then offer this as a service and take over more of the technical and kind of development work as a part of DPC workflows, so that garment vendors then use that as a bit of a value add. And here again, kind of, if any garment vendors are listening, I think this is a great opportunity coming up for garment vendors to show a bit of leadership and to offer this to brands. And then at the other hand, I think the other reason for why it makes sense for garment vendors to do this is also mainly based around a lot of the benefits of DPC are going to be most impactful to garment vendors, because they can save cost in the prototyping and kind of sampling stages and these things. So they're like a little bit at the center point. And so I'm going to try to summarize that in some more text. And for anyone that's interested, we'll see if that can come out this weekend.
Oh, that's good. I look forward to reading it.
Well, yeah, me too. But I think it's a really good point, like also this feedback that you've already given about, the actual understanding of prototyping and sampling, I think is very important already for, like, how do we continue to improve this? And I think that was everything. We went a little over time today. Lots of exciting things to talk about. But another week in the DPC world. We'll be back again next week for anyone celebrating Halloween tonight. And it's hope everyone has a good Halloween evening and
spooky nights.
Spooky nights, yes. We'll see everyone next week.
See you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Seamless Blend. If you enjoyed today's discussion, feel free to subscribe. We also invite you to connect with us and participate in our discussions on Discord. Let us know if you agree disagree, or have any questions. Until next time, take care.